The conquest of India is one of the longest and most complicated stories in human history, and by the 18th century it was already too much for our brains to handle. So that's when they brought in the professionals. Enter the British and Portuguese East India Companies, two of history's greatest corporations who went to India with the intention of trading spices but ended up conquering it. And today we're going to be learning all about them. But first, a quick word from our sponsor. In 1498, a man named Vasco da Gama landed on the southwestern coast of India in Calicut. He was Portuguese, so he wanted to trade with the Indians, but he soon found out that the Indians didn't want to trade with the Portuguese very much at all. The Zamorin, the ruler of Calicut, didn't need Vasco da Gama's help to get his spices to Europe. In fact, Indian merchants were already shipping their wares across the Arabian Sea to the Middle East, where eager European customers would buy them up faster than they could arrive. For the Portuguese, this was bad news because they'd come all this way only to find that there was no monopoly for them in the spice trade. Vasco da Gama was forced to leave empty-handed, realizing that unless he could find a way to control the supply of spices coming from India, he would never make any money off of this trip. Now, at this point, you might think that Vasco da Gama just decided to settle down and start a small business selling books or something, but this is extra history. So instead of settling down, he threatened the Indians that if they didn't let him have some of their spices, he would come back with a fleet of ships and take it by force. Then he did go back with a fleet of ships and took it by force, but not in Calicut. You see, the Zamorin of Calicut had prepared for this eventuality and had formed alliances with other local rulers to fend off the Portuguese attack. Vasco da Gama was easily defeated and had to escape to Sri Lanka, where he lived out the remainder of his life. But while Vasco da Gama failed, the Portuguese crown succeeded in conquering southwestern India between 1510 and 1525. They built fortified settlements and appointed governors to rule over them directly in the king's name. Though, to be fair, these territories were more like giant fortresses with a few small towns surrounding them. There were almost no people living inside the forts themselves, and the territory had little wealth. As a result, in 1524, the Portuguese sent a letter back to Lisbon asking for permission to turn the territory into a company so that private investors could put money into making it profitable. King Manuel I agreed to this proposal, creating the Portuguese India Company, though it turned out that wasn't really necessary, because the Portuguese had already conquered the Malacca Strait, which was actually much more valuable than India. So while the Portuguese India Company was founded in 1524, it never made it to India. Instead, it sailed to Macau and then spent its time controlling shipping lanes in China and Southeast Asia. Back in India, however, the situation was changing fast. While the Portuguese were sailing back to Portugal after failing to conquer India, the English and the Dutch had stepped onto the scene. They, too, wanted to trade in India, but also realized that the Indians had them beat in the spice game. So like the Portuguese before them, they tried to threaten the Indians into submission. The Indians fought back, though, pushing the English back to the coast and forcing them to charter ships from the Portuguese just to get inland. See, both the English and the Dutch had their own spice games back home. The Dutch East India Company already controlled Indonesia, the world's premier source of nutmeg, and mace, while England was growing rich off of importing pepper from the tiny island of Bantam, which was part of the Spice Islands. The problem was that both the Dutch and English spice games were dependent on the monsoon winds, which meant that they couldn't import spices year-round. Instead, they had to wait for the winds to shift from June to September, which left them without spices for 3/4 of the year. This didn't work very well, especially for the English, who quickly grew tired of waiting around to get their hands on some pepper. So they started looking for alternatives. Meanwhile, after being pushed to the coast, they met an Indian merchant named William Adams, who told them about a place called Japan. It turns out that Japan was a huge market for European luxury goods, like glasses and textiles. And in exchange, the Japanese were desperate for European ships, since they had none of their own. So the English gladly traded their ships for silk and silver, which they then sold in Europe for exorbitant prices. Then in 1609, the Dutch captured Taiwan, which became a major emporium for Chinese silk and porcelain on its way to Europe. Now, the English weren't thrilled with this arrangement because they liked taking profits off of the Chinese as much as anyone else. So they wanted to find another way to profit off of Asia. That's when William Adams remembered something he'd heard in India, that they had a lot of gold. The only problem was that the Indians didn't want to sell their gold to the English either, just like they didn't want to sell their spices. And so in 1611, the English chartered their first ship to India. It was called the Mayflower. No, wait, sorry, wrong Mayflower. That's the one that landed the Pilgrims in North America. This Mayflower landed in India. And despite not having any real success in India, the English continued to try again and again, finally establishing a permanent settlement in Surat in 1612. But this still wasn't enough because the English didn't really have access to the lucrative spice markets in the interior. To do that, they needed to form an alliance with the local rulers. And the best way to do that was to marry into their royal families. Enter the famous British East India Company, which began functioning in 1611, 2 years before they set up shop in India. Initially, the company functioned as a trading company, but it soon developed into a political and military power as well. By marrying into local families, controlling trade routes, and building up their own army, the British were slowly able to expand their influence throughout India during the early 1700s. They even went so far as to establish settlements of their own, such as Madras in 1639, Bombay in 1661, and Calcutta in 1690. Each of these settlements functioned as their own independent city-states, ruled over by the British East India Company rather than the Crown. By this time, the Portuguese had long since given up on ruling India, focusing instead on their colonies in Brazil. As a result, the British were free to expand across the subcontinent unchallenged. In 1757, they decisively defeated the Nawab of Bengal at the Battle of Plassey, gaining control of Bengal, which was incredibly wealthy thanks to its thriving textile industry. From there, the British fanned out across the subcontinent, battling local rulers and expanding the size of their holdings until they controlled most of the major cities and ports in 1764. Though the East India Company had now become a colonial empire, their purpose remained the same: making money. Their main source of revenue was collecting taxes from the Indians. At first, they mainly taxed the local rulers, but they eventually shifted to taxing the peasants. To do this, they created their own bureaucracy and judicial system, complete with judges and tax collectors. These systems were designed to be as efficient as possible, leading to the creation of modern accounting rules and the metric system. It was also during this time that the British began to lose interest in India's spices, finding that the stuff didn't really sell in Europe anymore. Instead, they started exporting raw cotton to England, where it could be manufactured into textiles and then sold back to the Indians. This change in focus was good for the British, but it was devastating for the Indians. The British had been importing textiles from India since the 1600s, and the Indian textile industry had grown to meet that demand. But now that they were exporting raw cotton, all of those weavers were suddenly out of work. As a result, entire communities of weavers took up arms to fight the British, but it didn't do them much good. The British had brought firearms with them to India, and they used them to great effect. The last major uprising against the British occurred in 1857. It's often referred to as the Sepoy Mutiny, referring to the Indian soldiers in the British Army called Sepoys, who kicked off the revolt. But the truth is that everyone hated the British at this point. So it was really a mass rebellion involving princes, soldiers, farmers, and thugs. Unfortunately for the Indians, the British had better weapons, and the Crown stepped in to put down the rebellion, taking direct control of India. Today, the British Empire is long gone, and India is independent once again. But the effects of British rule can still be felt throughout society. India is still struggling to undo many of the social and economic problems that were created during the days of the East India Company. If you want to learn more about how those problems continue to affect India today, check out our show The Biggest. Thanks for watching.